in the frozen silence of Maine's backcountry. A young woman was fighting a losing battle against the winter. Her family's land, once alive with running water and green fields, was now buried under ice, debt, and loneliness. She thought no one would ever come. But fate had a strange way of keeping promises. Down a snow-choked road, an old Ford pickup crawled through the storm, carrying a Navy SEAL and his loyal German Shepherd. What they found that night, and what that K-9 did next, would change everything she believed about courage, redemption, and love. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Snow drifted down in slow, deliberate silence across the northern hills of Maine, where winter had a way of swallowing sound and time alike. The sky was a dull pewter, heavy with clouds that promised another storm before nightfall. In the hollow between two ridges, a small farmhouse stood half buried in white, shutters trembling against the wind, chimney breathing thin smoke into the frozen air. Inside, Clara Dawson moved like a shadow through the cold. At 22, she carried herself with the quiet endurance of someone who'd had to grow up too fast. She was tall and lean, her strength not from luxury, but survival. Her hair, light brown and pulled into a rough braid, framed a face marked by the hard geometry of rural winters, pale skin, chapped lips, and eyes the color of storm water. They were sharp eyes, always scanning, always cautious. For 6 years, Clara had run her family's farm alone. It wasn't much, a few cattle, a stubborn garden, and the spring that bubbled at the edge of her land, a thin trickle of crystal water that never froze, even when everything else did. That spring was her heart and her curse. Developers had tried to buy it. Companies had sent letters offering sums she couldn't imagine. She'd burned every one of them. The land was her inheritance, her prison, and her proof of strength. She had learned long ago that help rarely came without a price. That afternoon, as the sun sagged behind the ridge, Clara was outside splitting firewood. Her wool gloves were stiff with frost, her breath curling into mist. She swung the axe rhythmically, the crack of wood echoing across the still fields. Between strikes, she stopped to listen. The quiet of winter was deceptive. It could hide danger as easily as peace. Then she heard it. A low, steady rumble carried on the wind. An engine. Clara straightened, heart kicking hard against her ribs. No one drove up here in winter. The nearest town, Maple Hollow, was 20 miles away, and even the mail truck stopped running once the snow got deep. She set the axe down, brushing the ice from her sleeves, and stared down the slope. Through the blur of falling snow, headlights emerged, twin beams cutting through the gray. A Ford F-150, old and scarred, crawled up the rutted road, engine growling like an old animal. Clara's pulse quickened. She didn't expect visitors, and she didn't like surprises. The truck came to a stop near the barn. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a weathered field jacket lined with fleece. His jeans were faded, his boots scuffed, but his movements were deliberate, too controlled for a drifter or salesman. His hair was dark brown with a few streaks of gray at the temples, and several days of stubble shadowed his jaw. His face was cut with angles, the kind that looked carved more than grown. His eyes were steady, quiet, but not cold. There was a fatigue there, not the kind from work, but from living too long with ghosts. A German Shepherd leapt down from the truck bed after him, landing light despite its size. Its coat was thick and sable-colored, its amber eyes alert but calm. The dog didn't bark. It simply watched, head tilted slightly, reading every flicker of movement. Clara's hand went instinctively to the revolver on her hip. "You lost?" she called out, voice sharp and carrying across the frozen yard. The man stopped a few paces from her, raising his hands slightly, palms open. "Not lost," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying the tone of someone used to giving orders without raising volume. "Name's Ethan Cole. I used to serve with the Navy." Clara narrowed her eyes. "That's supposed to mean something to me?" Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. "Not unless you served, too." The dog came to sit by his side, posture perfect. The man's eyes flicked to the spring behind her house, where steam curled faintly from the unfrozen water. "That spring yours?" "It is," she said flatly. "And it's not for sale." "I didn't come to buy anything." "Then what are you doing here?" Ethan hesitated, snow gathering on his jacket shoulders, melting as it met his body heat. "Looking for someone." Clara crossed her arms. "You found me. Now you can leave." He didn't move. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the quiet breathing of the dog. Then, slowly, he met her eyes, steady, searching, but not unkind. There was something there she couldn't quite name. "A promise," he said finally, voice almost a whisper. "I made one a long time ago." The words caught her off guard. Clara blinked, her grip on the revolver easing just a fraction. "To who?" she asked. But Ethan didn't answer. He just stood there in the falling snow, the storm beginning to swallow him and the dog into its pale curtain. There was a stillness in him, the kind that comes from knowing something you can't yet say. And though Clara didn't understand it, she felt the faintest shiver of unease, as if somewhere, buried under all that snow, something old was waking up. The snow didn't stop that night. It thickened, piling over the barn roof and swallowing the road until the world seemed reduced to white and wind. Clara had locked herself inside the house after that strange encounter, drawing the curtains tight as if fabric could block out questions. Through the frosted glass, she saw faint movement, the dull orange flicker of a small fire near the truck. Ethan Cole hadn't left. He had set up a lean-to beside his old Ford, a thin shelter of canvas and determination, the kind of setup that spoke of long nights on battlefields and in deserts. His German shepherd, Ranger, slept near the warmth, his nose tucked beneath his paw, only his ears moving when the wind changed. Clara told herself it didn't matter. He would leave when the storm broke. Men like that always left. But 3 days passed, and the storm refused to end. The food shelves inside her pantry were growing bare. 2 cans of beans, a few scoops of flour, and half a jar of coffee grounds that smelled faintly of smoke. Clara hated the thought of leaving the farm unattended. It was habit more than fear, yet hunger has a way of pushing pride aside. Early the next morning, she loaded her old Chevy into gear. The engine sputtered like an old smoker before settling into a rough hum. Clara wrapped a scarf around her neck, pulled her wool cap low, and glanced once toward the ridge. Ethan was out there, splitting kindling beside his tent. He looked up briefly, the morning frost catching on his stubble, and gave a small nod. She didn't return it. The drive to Maple Hollow was long and mean. The snowplows hadn't been through in days, and drifts rose like pale waves across the backroads. Clara's hands ached from gripping the wheel, her eyes fixed on the thin line of gray sky that marked where road became horizon. The town appeared suddenly, a scatter of buildings pressed against the cold, their windows glowing faintly yellow in the morning gloom. Henderson's Market, the only real store for 20 miles, sat at the corner of Main Street, its sign swinging weakly in the wind. The bell above the door chimed as Clara entered, bringing with her a gust of cold air and a swirl of snow. Behind the counter stood Lydia Henderson, the owner's wife, a woman in her 50s with round glasses and the sturdy calm of someone who'd survived more winters than she cared to count. "Clara Dawson," she greeted with mild surprise. "Haven't seen you in near a month." "Ran out of supplies," Clara said simply, stomping the snow from her boots. She moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, flour, salt, coffee, and a box of 30-30 cartridges. She didn't linger, but the weight of opt eyes followed her all the same. At the far end of the store, near the heater, stood Richard Cross, tall, well-fed, mid-40s, the kind of man whose wealth hung on him like an expensive coat. His black overcoat was spotless, his leather gloves soft and tailored, his smile practiced to hide cruelty. He owned Cross Pure, the local water bottling company, and half the county knew he wanted the Dawson Spring. "Well, if it isn't the Ice Queen of Ridge Hollow," he drawled, setting down a cup of coffee. His voice had the smoothness of someone who believed every word was a favor. "Heard you've been keeping yourself busy freezing up there. That spring of yours still running?" Clara ignored the bait, stacking her items on the counter. "It's fine." Cross stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know, that water's worth more than any cow you've got left. Sooner or later, you'll have to sell. Might as well do it before someone gets hurt trying to take it." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Blue, sharp, calculating. He had grown up poor, rumor said, before buying his first plot of land and learning how power tasted. The town saw him as respectable. Clara saw him as a vulture. She met his stare coolly. "You'll have to freeze with me first." Lydia cleared her throat behind the counter. "That'll be $43.70, Clara." Clara paid in cash and left without another word, her pulse still thrumming. Outside, the snow had turned to a bitter, wind-blown mist. Across the street, the sheriff's office sat half-buried in drifts. She hesitated only a second before crossing. Sheriff Mark Bailey was behind his desk when she entered, polishing a thermos lid. He was in his late 50s, built like a man who'd once been strong, but now relied on authority instead of muscle. His face was lined, his mustache silvered, and his uniform jacket strained slightly around the middle. On the wall behind him hung an old photograph of him in uniform, younger, prouder, back before the quiet years had softened him. "Morning, Miss Dawson," he said without looking up. "What brings you into town?" "I've got a problem," Clara said, gripping the strap of her bag. "A man showed up at my property 3 days ago. He's camping there. Says he's a Navy SEAL." Bailey looked up at that, an eyebrow raised. "Did he threaten you?" "No." "Steal anything?" "No." He shrugged. "Then there's no crime." Clara stared at him. "He's trespassing on private land." "Snow like this? Maybe he just needs shelter." "Look, Miss Dawson," he sighed, leaning back. "We've got calls about road closures, power outages, and some kids stuck in a ditch near County Route 9. I can't send a deputy 20 miles into the mountains for someone who hasn't done anything wrong." "So you're not going to do anything?" "Not unless he gives me a reason." He capped his thermos, tone final. Stay inside, lock your doors. The snow will drive him off sooner than I can. Clara left before her temper cracked. Outside, the cold bit at her cheeks, sharper than before. The drive back was slower. Her thoughts were faster. By the time her farmhouse came into view, dusk had already started its slow descent. Ethan's truck was still there. His campfire glowed dimly against the storm-dark sky. He didn't look up as she parked, only gave a brief whistle. Ranger rose instantly, shaking off snow and trotting toward the pasture. The dog moved with purposeful grace, nudging the cattle away from the frozen stream where the ice had begun to crack. Clara watched from the porch, her anger dulling into something she didn't want to name. Later that night, when she opened her door to bring in firewood, something caught her eye. A freshly dressed haunch of venison laid neatly on the flat stone by her steps. There were no footprints leading to it. The falling snow had already swallowed them. By morning, the section of her fence that had collapsed in the wind was repaired, wire taut, posts reinforced with care. She stared at it for a long time, the hammer still in her hand, feeling something uneasy and warm blooming in her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure whether she was truly alone. The blizzard had rolled in from the coast overnight, blanketing the valley in a cold that bit through walls and bone alike. The world beyond Clara's farmhouse had vanished. Only a white blur pressed against the windows, howling like something alive. The old wood stove hissed and snapped, trying to keep up, but even its glow seemed tired. Inside, Clara sat wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the storm roar through the pines. She hadn't seen Ethan all morning, though faint traces of smoke from his campfire still rose beyond the barn. Somehow, knowing he was still there, stubborn, wordless, unsettled her more than if he had left. By late afternoon, the wind quieted, leaving behind a world so still it seemed sacred. Clara stepped outside, boots crunching on the frozen porch. The air burned her lungs, but the silence drew her forward. Ethan was standing near the fence line, his coat dusted with snow, Ranger pacing beside him. The man looked carved from the same cold that ruled the valley, motionless, purposeful. When he saw her, he gave a slight nod, as if he'd been expecting her all along. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, pulling her scarf tighter. "Storm's easing," he replied. His voice carried a calm warmth that somehow didn't belong in such a frozen place. "I wanted to make sure your spring didn't freeze over." "It never does." She hesitated, then added quietly, "It's the one thing that never gives up." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Then it takes after you." Clara looked away, heat rising to her cheeks despite the cold. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, after a long breath, Ethan said, "You deserve to know why I came here." He motioned toward the barn, where the wind was quieter. Inside it smelled of hay, oil, and the faint, comforting scent of animals. Clara leaned against a post while Ethan stood near the door, the light from a small lantern throwing his face into sharp relief. Strong jaw, lines of exhaustion, eyes that had seen too much. 16 years ago, he began, I was stationed in Maine for a winter survival exercise, Navy training. My unit got separated in a snowstorm near these woods. I was 20 then, young, stupid, and thought I was invincible. The ice on a creek gave way under me. The water was black, freezing. I remember the shock, like being punched by death itself. I tried to crawl out, but the current pulled me under the ice. By the time I surfaced, I could barely move. He paused, jaw tightening at the memory. Ranger lay down near the hay pile, ears tilted forward, sensing his master's unease. Clara's chest tightened. She could picture it. A younger version of the man before her, lost in a storm that had no mercy. I don't know how long I drifted, Ethan continued. But then someone grabbed me. A man, tall, hair going gray, hands rough from work. He dragged me out, half dead, carried me to a barn that smelled like this one. He wrapped me in blankets, lit a fire in an iron pan, and fed me broth so hot, I thought my throat would burn. I remember his voice more than his face. Quiet, steady. The kind of voice that made you think the world wasn't ending after all. Clara felt her breath catch. "My father," she whispered. Ethan nodded once. "Yes. He told me his name was Thomas Dawson. Said I'd been lucky, but I told him luck had nothing to do with it. He saved me. I stayed there for 3 days while the storm passed. He never asked for anything. Never even told the town I was there. Said the world didn't need to know everything to do the right thing. Before I left, I saw a little girl watching from the porch. She had your eyes." For the first time in years, Clara felt tears prick at the back of her throat. She remembered flashes, the storm that winter, her father's laughter as he came in from the cold, a stranger's voice echoing faintly from the barn. Ethan's voice dropped lower, gentler. "When I left, I promised him something. He told me to go back to the Navy, finish what I'd started. But I swore to him that if his daughter ever needed help, if she was ever alone, I'd come back. I kept that promise. Took me years to find this place again." Clara stared at him, struggling between disbelief and the pull of recognition. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks of the barn, soft as a lullaby. "You came all this way," she murmured, "because of a promise made 16 years ago?" Ethan gave a short nod. "Some debts don't expire." The silence between them stretched. Then Ranger stood, walked over, and rested his heavy head on Clara's knee. His eyes were calm, warm, the kind of eyes that see through walls people build around themselves. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she reached down to touch his fur. The dog's body was solid and steady, radiating warmth that felt more human than anything she'd known in years. "Your father didn't just save my life," Ethan said quietly. "He changed it. I was a soldier then. Afterward, I became something else. A man who understood what loyalty really means. When I saw that spring still running, I knew you'd kept the same promise he did." Clara swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "I didn't keep it for him. I kept it because I had nothing else." Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady. "Sometimes that's the same thing." For a long time, the only sound was Ranger's slow breathing. The cold didn't seem to bite anymore. Something unseen had shifted in the air. The storm had broken, both outside and within. When Ethan finally left the barn, Clara remained seated on the hay, one hand still resting on Ranger's head. She looked at the spring glinting faintly in the moonlight beyond the window. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. The storm returned like vengeance. By dusk, the valley had vanished beneath a wall of swirling white, the kind of blizzard that erased all sense of direction and mercy. The wind shrieked through the trees, bending the pines as if trying to rip the earth apart. Inside the farmhouse, Clara sat near the window, listening to the glass rattle in its frame. The world outside was blind and endless, but something about the silence between gusts made her uneasy. She couldn't explain it. A tension, low and coiled, like a wire ready to snap. Ethan was in the barn, checking the generator. He had repaired it earlier that afternoon, his hands steady and sure despite the cold. Clara had watched him work, the lamplight catching the hard lines of his jaw and the faint scars along his forearm. The quiet history of a soldier written in skin. Now he moved with purpose, as though some part of him had already sensed what was coming. Ranger prowled near the door. Fur bristled, a low growl rolling deep in his chest. Miles away, in the polished warmth of his office in town, Richard Cross was speaking to a dozen men who looked like they belonged in trouble more than in work. He wore his usual black coat, his blonde hair slicked back neatly, his sharp blue eyes colder than the snowstorm outside. On his desk lay a map of the Dawson property, marked with red ink. "They're armed," said one of the hired guards, a stocky man named Kurt Danner, whose thick beard barely hid a scar that ran from his jaw to his ear. He had the look of someone who used to wear a badge before losing the right to. Cross smiled thinly. "Then we'll bring more firepower. We go in quiet, just enough noise to make it look like a rescue. The sheriff will thank me later for cleaning up his mess." The men chuckled, but their laughter didn't reach their eyes. They weren't doing this for heroism. They were doing it for cash. By midnight, the convoy of 3 trucks rolled out of town. Their headlights cut through the storm like spears, their engines growling against the snow-laden wind. Back at the farm, Ethan was securing the barn doors when Ranger began barking. Not frantic, but sharp and deliberate. A signal. Ethan froze, listening. Over the roar of the wind, faint but unmistakable, came the low rumble of approaching engines. His body went rigid. The kind of silence before violence. He knew it too well. He ran to the farmhouse, snow slapping against his coat. Clara met him at the door, rifle already in hand. Her face was pale but steady. "You hear it too?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice clipped, controlled. "Get the lights off. Move the animals into the back enclosure. Ranger, guard perimeter." The dog bolted into the storm, vanishing into the curtain of white. Clara followed Ethan's lead without question. It was strange. Just days ago, she would have told him to leave. Now, as he moved through the chaos with calm precision, she found herself trusting him instinctively. He barked orders the way men do who've led others through worse than this. The first truck appeared at the edge of the pasture, headlights blazing through the snow. Ethan crouched by the porch, rifle braced. "They're coming in fast," he muttered. Another beam of light flared to the left, then another. The farmyard exploded in brightness. Headlights, flashlights, men shouting against the wind. Clara's heart pounded in her ears. She caught sight of Cross through the haze, standing by the lead truck, shouting something she couldn't hear. The men beside him fanned out, rifles slung low. Ethan took aim, firing a warning shot into the air. "Turn back," he shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. "This is private property." Cross's answer came in the form of a muzzle flash. The bullet tore through the porch railing, sending splinters across Clara's boots. That was all the permission Ethan needed. "Down!" he yelled, pulling Clara behind a barrel as the gunfire erupted. The sound was deafening. Sharp cracks of rifles mixed with the hollow percussion of the storm. Snow churned into mist under the bursts of light. Clara raised her rifle and fired, her hands trembling only for the first shot. The bullet hit one of the truck tires, bursting it with a hiss. She chambered another round, faster this time. The years of hunting deer with her father came back to her in flashes. Breath, aim, pull, repeat. Ranger reappeared like a ghost, darting between the shadows. He lunged at a man trying to reach the barn with a jerry can, tackling him hard into the snow. The man screamed, dropped the can, and fled, leaving a trail of red where Ranger's teeth had grazed his arm. "Good boy," Ethan muttered under his breath, firing again. His shots were surgical, one after another, deliberate and unhurried. It wasn't a fight. It was containment. A Navy SEAL's version of mercy. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared and the snow settled, 2 trucks were abandoned, one still smoldering from a ruptured gas line. The men who had come for her were gone, stumbling back toward town, their courage frozen out of them. Ethan exhaled, breath fogging in the air. He lowered his rifle, scanning for movement. "You okay?" Clara nodded, her chest rising and falling, the barrel of her gun smoking faintly. "I think so." From the distance, Ranger trotted back, his fur matted with snow, eyes bright and alert. He came to stand beside Clara, leaning against her leg. She dropped a hand to his head, fingers brushing the warmth of his neck. Then the lights appeared, red and blue flashing through the snow. The sheriff's cruiser crawled up the ridge, tires spinning in the slush. Mark Bailey stepped out, his face pale and drawn in the storm's harsh glare. Behind him, a deputy lifted a flashlight toward the house. "What the hell happened here?" Bailey demanded. Ethan straightened, lowering his rifle carefully. "You should ask Richard Cross." Cross himself was being dragged from behind the wreck of his truck, his fine coat torn, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They shot at us!" he shouted hoarsely. "They had weapons. I was trying to save her." But the evidence said otherwise. The dashboard camera on Ethan's Ford still glowed red, the lens cracked but intact. It had caught everything. The approach, the gunfire, the men shouting. Bailey watched the replay in silence, his jaw tightening. When it ended, he looked from the screen to Clara, standing beside the SEAL and his dog, both motionless in the storm's dying breath. The truth was undeniable. For once, Sheriff Bailey didn't say a word. The morning after the gunfire dawned clear and impossibly still. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt sacred. Snow stretched across the valley in soft, untouched folds. The farmhouse stood steady and proud, its roof glazed with frost that caught the rising sun like shards of glass. The smoke from the chimney rose straight and unbroken. For the first time in weeks, the world seemed to breathe again. Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in her father's old wool coat, the same one he used to wear during lambing season. Her breath curled upward in slow, white ribbons. In her hands, she held a cup of coffee gone cold, but she barely noticed. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. Flashes of gunfire, the scream of the wind, Ethan's steady voice cutting through the chaos. It felt like something that had happened years ago, not just hours. Ethan came from the barn, his steps sure despite the ice. He wore his field jacket open, sleeves rolled to his elbows, as though the cold couldn't reach him. The early light caught in his stubble and turned the tired lines around his eyes to silver. He looked older now, but not weaker. There was a kind of quiet authority about him, the sort that comes from having faced too much and survived anyway. Behind him, Ranger trotted at an easy pace, muzzle flecked with frost, tail swaying like a metronome of calm. The German shepherd had a thin scratch along his shoulder from the fight, but it didn't slow him. He moved with that same controlled readiness, his gaze sweeping the horizon as if making sure the world was safe enough for the humans it held dear. "Sheriff's office just left," Ethan said, stepping onto the porch beside her. His voice was rough from lack of sleep, but steady. "They took Cross to the county jail. Charges: trespassing, armed assault, and attempted arson." Clara nodded faintly. "He'll find a lawyer. Men like him always do." "Maybe," Ethan replied. "But the evidence is ironclad. The dash cam, the rounds recovered. Even Bailey couldn't ignore that." At the mention of the sheriff, Clara allowed herself a small, wry smile. Guess the snow didn't wash everything clean after all. Ethan looked at her, his gaze softening. Not everything needs to be washed clean. A light wind stirred the snow around their boots, whispering through the barren apple trees by the fence. Clara glanced toward the spring, that ever-persistent thread of clear water glinting against the white. It seemed almost to glow under the morning light. For so long, it had been something she guarded, something she feared losing. Now it looked different, not a secret to protect, but a gift to share. Later that week, a woman from the Maine Environmental Preservation Board arrived. Margaret O'Neill, in her late 40s, compact and purposeful, with hair the color of wet chestnut and eyes like winter moss. Her coat was thick and practical, her handshake firm. She had the brisk patience of someone who dealt with bureaucrats daily, but still believed in the goodness of ordinary people. "The spring qualifies for heritage protection," she said, glancing over the documents on the farmhouse table. "It's officially designated as a local landmark, the Dawson Spring. No corporation can claim extraction rights without your consent now." Clara listened, silent for a long time, then nodded. Her fingers traced the signature line. "Then it stays with the land." Margaret smiled. "That's how it should be." After the papers were signed, the agent left, her truck tires crunching down the frozen path. The farmhouse felt different afterward, not larger, not warmer, but freer, as if some invisible weight had finally lifted from its walls. That evening, Ethan found Clara by the spring. The light was fading, the air a deep cobalt blue. The water gurgled softly under its thin rim of ice. She was sitting on a rock, coat drawn close, her hair undone for once, loose around her shoulders like spilled sunlight. He approached quietly, boots sinking into the snow. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected, looking up at him. For a moment, they stood there in the stillness, two figures framed against the pale world, bound by something older than gratitude. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, the metal worn smooth from years of carrying. Inside lay a simple silver ring, faintly tarnished, the kind of ring that wasn't bought but inherited. He set it gently on the rock between them. "I made a promise once, to your father, and maybe to myself too," he said, his voice low. "I kept it. But the choice, that's yours." Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the spring's shimmer. The ring caught the faintest light. Nothing grand, nothing showy. But it carried the kind of beauty that endures. Her lips curved into a smile that started small and grew, soft as thawing ice. "Yes," she said simply. For a while neither moved. The wind rustled through the trees, and a flock of crows took flight from the ridge, their wings scattering snow into silver dust. Ranger lay down beside them, resting his head on his paws, watching with the tranquil patience of a creature that understood more than words ever could. As dawn broke the next morning, the valley glowed under a pale sun. Ethan repaired the fence by the pasture, Clara tended to the cattle, and Ranger patrolled the yard like a silent guardian. The world felt steady again, not because it was perfect, but because it had finally been earned. And through every frost, through every winter to come, the spring continued to flow, a heartbeat beneath the snow, a reminder that some promises never freeze. Sometimes, miracles don't come as thunder or lightning. They arrive in the quiet tread of a dog's paws, or in the voice of a man who keeps his promise. In the frozen stillness of Maine, where hope once lay buried beneath snow and silence, love rose like a spring, unseen but unstoppable. And maybe, just maybe, God doesn't always move mountains. Sometimes he just sends someone willing to climb them with you. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who might need a little light today. Leave us a comment. Tell us where you're watching from, or share your own story of faith and resilience. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of love, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, and may you always find warmth, even in the coldest winter.